for a little office party. Honestly, that office party happened. I think that would be pretty incredible, actually. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a map of the latest violence in Iraq. And when mainstream media focuses on the surge of violence there, the conversation revolves around whether or not the U.S. military should intervene again and who is to blame for the violence unfolding in the region. But there's also a bigger question about the role the U.S. should play in national security around the world. Joining us is Joel Pollack, senior editor-at-large of Breitbart News. Welcome to the show, Joel.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to start just by asking a simple question before we get into Iraq. When do you think interventionism, Joel, I'll start with you, is necessary?
I think it's necessary when it affects your fundamental national interest and when you actually have the ability to carry out a strategic goal. So that doesn't mean every humanitarian crisis requires intervention, but it does mean that when you can do something positive and it aligns with your strategic goals, for example, if it supports your war on terror or if it counteracts an enemy or helps an ally, then I think that's the time to intervene.
Megan, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think, I actually think if there's a humanitarian crisis, like in terms of Bosnia, that's a good example too, but I totally agree with you.
Hey, Ahmed, what about you, man?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about, the shifting kind of alliances that we see because, we talk about humanitarian reasons or to promote democracy or if it even, as you said, serves your strategic goals. But I think in the Arab world in particular, we're talking about Iraq, obviously. I mean, not only do we need to look at when we have intervened and how it's gone horribly wrong, for example, Iraq, the occupation, a decade of essentially destroying not only the country, but I think the social fabric and exacerbating some of the sectarian tensions, but more importantly, looking at where you haven't intervened and why you haven't intervened. I think that's where a lot of the criticism comes. For example, in Bahrain, in places like Saudi Arabia, which are, of course, close allies to the United States, but a lot of Arabs and I think anti-American sentiment and Muslims is born out of this notion that the U.S. only intervenes when it serves their national interests, even though they proclaim that it's on humanitarian grounds.
Joel, you want to quickly respond to that? Because I want to bring up something that you wrote, actually.
Sure, I don't think anything that the U.S. and U.S. allies did in Iraq is remotely as disruptive as what Saddam Hussein did. I mean, especially to talk about entire civilizations like the Marsh Arabs being wiped out in Iraq and things like that. I do think that's correct criticism of interventionism in general, that why do you intervene in some cases and not others? But I think it's also important to remember that not intervening is also a choice that has consequences. And so deciding not to intervene can also mean prolonging something very bad that might be counteracted if you do intervene.
Let's talk specifically about what's going on in Iraq, because Joel wrote an article, and I want to read from it, that said, this was not inevitable. If the U.S. had kept some forces in Iraq, as our military urged, and as we've done in other post-war nations, the country might have remained intact. Ahmed, what do you think about this?
I mean, I take issue with the premise of this statement. I know that you said that it wasn't inevitable what's happening now, but I think anyone who's familiar with the culture, and I take issue also with the notion that under Saddam Hussein things were worse. I think if you ask any Iraqi, and also, quite frankly, on the face of it, the country is now in shambles. The reason we're here and talking about it is because of the U.S. intervention. I would imagine your average Iraqi citizen would tell you that things were better, whether they were Sunni, Shia, or Kurd. I mean, never has the country been closer to falling apart and disintegrating. But on the notion of it staying intact, I mean, I think the minute that they went in on false pretense, with no real strategy, I think it was very clear that the country could never stay intact and that this situation that we find ourselves in was inevitable. I mean, the U.S. government, it's important to just kind of look at it from this perspective, installed the only Shiite-led government in the Arab world. And Maliki himself, who was living in exile in Iran for quite some time, even though the Shias are a majority, there's a large Sunni majority, and he never showed any indication, either rhetorically or in his actions, that he was ever going to actually try to unite the country after this horrible war. So I don't know that the U.S. ever had a choice to leave the troops there, especially since because he spent time in Iran, and Iran is such a close ally of not just Maliki, but the Shia-led government, Iran set a condition that there was absolutely no way that American troops could remain in Iraq. So they never signed the Status Forces Agreement, which would have protected U.S. soldiers.
I don't think that's the only reason we didn't sign the Status of Forces Agreement. I don't think the Obama administration was ever serious about signing it or negotiating it in good faith. Obama came into office with the surge having been completed, having been successful, thanks in large part to your father's advocacy. And I think that the Iraq Obama inherited was one on the path to stability and prosperity. Now, it was a rocky path, but there were fewer civilian deaths, fewer military deaths. It was going somewhere positive. I also think that strategically, it made a lot of sense for us to have troops in Iraq because it also put pressure on Iran. Iran is our strategic rival in the region, and I don't think that anything that helps Iran is necessarily going to be good for us.
But Joel,
and I think having troops there is part of the reason Iranians took to the streets in 2009. They saw troops to the left, troops to the right. A tyranny fall in Iraq, a tyranny fall in Afghanistan. Afghanistan and they rose up against their own government. If we had had a different doctrine, one that pursued our strategic interests, which I believe extends to changing the government in Iran, I think we would have been able to help the people of Iran democratize
Look,
their
guys,
own
let's come back around to Iran in just a second, but I want to get everybody at home that wants to talk about this in right now. Because earlier in the show, we asked you guys if you think the U.S. has a responsibility to intervene in Iraq. Here's what you all said. First and foremost, here's the poll results. 83% of you said that you do not think the United States has a responsibility to intervene in Iraq. We have tweets as well from those of you watching live right now. I think we have a fair amount of them, as a matter of fact. Here's the first one. This one is from JT3, who says, yes, the U.S. needs to intervene, should have never left the region, hashtag USA in Iraq. Here's another one from KMJ, who says, quite resoundingly, no, hashtag USA in Iraq. Here's one from Jason, who says, we decided our own fate during our civil war. The people of Iraq can decide their own fate with their civil war. Another one from BBW Woof, who says, I say no more involvement in Iraq. That fight's been going on for centuries and will never end. And finally, I think here's one from 12 Mile Geo, who says, we've been down that rabbit hole. It didn't work so well for us. So the question is, did we learn from our mistake? And Joel, it looks like the poll, people sort of agree with that last tweet.
Yeah, I think their skepticism is well-founded. I think under the present conditions, intervention doesn't make that much sense because we don't have the foothold we had and lost in 2009 through 2011 and beyond. And I also think this administration is not committed to succeeding. You know, Obama never uses the word victory when he describes Iraq or other conflicts. And I think that intervening by sending a few drones overhead is really not going to be a way to resolve what's actually wrong in Iraq. And I think that intervening could actually make things a lot
Iran
worse.
came up earlier, and I just want to make sure to get Iran in here because Iraq's neighbors, Iran and Turkey, obviously have a major stake in the region.
Yeah.
Do you think that they should leave it to the... we should leave it to the stations
really
to intervene?
quick?
Yeah, please do.
So I hate to make this personal, but I have two brothers in the military. One that was in Iraq, countless friends that were over there. And when we pulled out, they were all, for the most part, quite upset. And they didn't believe that we should have been pulling out when we did. And then when everything started happening last week, a lot of people blamed Obama pulling us out. I just want to know how you would respond to that.
I think what was interesting was to see some of the interviews, and more than just saying I had friends who died there, or I lost a limb there, or I paid a terrible price. You saw a genuine empathy with the Iraqi people and saying, I had relationships with people there. I tried to make people better off. I tried to help people build governments, and it's those people that I'm worried about. And I think that was really striking from our men and women in uniform.
And I read a quote about that too, and I wasn't surprised, but I found the compassion quite moving for the Iraqi people.
One thing I want to ask, just because I'm concerned slightly as to whether I understood something you said. In 2009 and 2010, there seemed to be a perception that was portrayed and perpetuated by the mainstream media, I think here in the U.S., that things were starting to get better just because some of the death tolls went down. But the truth is that's when we saw some of the Sunni militias, including ISIS and others, actually increase their attacks.
Which actually Chelsea Manning wrote about in the New York Times this weekend.
Right, and he said that raises fundamental questions as to how the mainstream media was covering it. So what indication did you have that's factually based that things were getting better and that we had a lost opportunity?
The statistics you cited, I think when fewer people are dying, I think that's a pretty good sign that things are getting better. I mean, there are different tensions.
Marginal. It was marginal.
It was actually quite dramatic from the start of the surge to the point at which the status of forces agreement expired. It was quite a dramatic reduction in civilian deaths.
In civilian deaths, but not in terms of some of the militias. In the north, it was actually, it's actually factually true.
I mean, you can't have it both ways. You either care about civilians or you don't.
Of course I care about civilians, but I'm just trying to suggest that I think it's important, as we heard from Chelsea Manning, that there is a limit to how much knowledge and I think analysis we can provide when the mainstream media was neglecting Iraq, just like you see this week, for example, on MSNBC, CNN. They have a strap that says Iraq in crisis. Well, would you argue that last year, or in those years that you were discussing, 2008, 2009, even with that marginal decrease in some civilian deaths, that things were actually getting better, that Iraq wasn't in crisis? Iraq has been in crisis since 2003.
I think that the crisis had some hope of being resolved, and I think the more it was clear we didn't have a commitment to staying and helping Iraq manage this transition, I think there were opportunistic forces, not just within Iraq, but from outside Iraq, from Syria, from Iran, that intervened, these militias that want to establish a caliphate in the region and so forth. They saw the weakness of the Iraqi state as building with our leaving, and I think they took advantage of that.
Yeah, I think that was just a product of the fact that we were there to begin with. I don't think it has to do with us leaving.
All right, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We want to thank Joel Pollak for joining us today. Thanks so much for being here, Joel. And to learn more about the situation in Iraq, go to takepart.com and read Scott Johnson's article on the topic. And since we didn't get to nearly all the tweets or the things that we want to talk about here, quite frankly, after the break, we're going to share more of your thoughts before we go, so stay tuned. Joel, thanks so much.
That was cool.
That was awesome. Yeah. Great. Yeah.